I've always been a political junkie since growing up in Boston, where half of my candidates would end up in the federal penitentiary, the other half in the state penitentiary. Massachusetts is one of those states where certain felons, convicted felons, cannot vote. Vermont, I think Florida. I mean, if you commit a crime, you're not going to vote anymore. Well, Massachusetts had, typically in Boston, Massachusetts tradition, their law is all felons can vote when they get out of prison, except for those convicted of voter fraud, which is half the prison population. Over the last year, I was talking to Larry off and on, and I'm not going to go into the election process here, but I thought, gee, it would be fun to invoke Churchill and Trump in the same breath, so to speak, because I've always been a troublemaker, and I always went to detention throughout my school career. I knew this would aggravate some people. A lot of emergency room visits when this was announced for apoplexy. And sure enough, Larry has 25 or 30,000 followers, and I began getting emails from people like, what are you talking about? Trump and Churchill in the same breath? And I spoke to a young reporter here in Birmingham, and I said, please note the question mark. Trump and Churchill, similarities? The question mark is the key here. Then I got a call and an email a few days ago from a very high holy Churchillian, and people like me who are Churchill fans call themselves Churchillians, and there are thousands around the world. There's a great group here in Birmingham. I spoke to them last year and the year before. And my friend called and said, Trump and Churchill? What are you going to tell these people in Birmingham? I said, well, you have to come. And he's in Chicago, so he's not here. But I said, don't worry. And he said, and this is exactly what he told me. He said, I hope that Pence and Ryan, who I like, he said, run the government. In other words, because this guy Trump, not going to do it well. And I said, okay, well, it was great talking to you, and we'll see you at the next Churchill conference. And the question mark is the key, because people I've spoken to, again, said, Trump, Churchill, in the same breath, yikes. And you gotta, consider the guy. There's a guy whose taxes never saw the light of day, and he didn't care what the criticism was. He reached the heights of financial success several times to use the bankruptcy laws to leave a parade of debtors in his wake, and arcane accounting laws and currency regulations and securities regulations and banking regulations to get up to his feet again, and shrouds his entire financial empire in blind trusts with overseas cronies funneling money at the right exchange rate to do this and borrow that and work with banks from countries nobody's ever heard of. His first real estate venture ended in one of those financial debacles of unpaid people, and known for not paying his bills, paying them late, if at all. Nasty, if you criticize him, he promised, I will sue you for libel, and he spent a lot of time in libel courts. But when he criticized the opposition, it was in 140 characters or less, 10 words, 12 words, and he would call his political enemies, even in his own party, spineless wonders who should be in the carnival, cowards, fools, lackeys, idiots, stupid. If you worked for him and you didn't like what your productivity was, you're fired. And on and on and on. A bad manager of business, not a great empire builder. but enough of Winston Churchill, because all of what I just said is true. It's not cherry-picked. It's not vastly out of context. Excuse me, I don't have a cold, but it's this New England weather. That was Winston. Now, in the prologue to the book, in May of 1940, on May 9th, when Hitler ordered the attack the next day, the Conservative Party, of which Churchill was one, knew that the Chamberlain government was finished. And one of these Mandarin Foreign Office workers, analogous to a lifelong State Department employee over here, kept a diary, Alec Cadogan. And he said, who's going to be the new PM? Chamberlain is out. Is it Sam Hoare? Is it Lord Halifax? And he has this list, and he gets to the end, and with an exclamation point, he says, Winston, useless. And he was made prime minister the next day. His own people in his own party despised him. It was the Labour Party, his traditional enemies, who said, we'll serve under only one prime minister, and that's Churchill. So in he goes, and before then, his reputation was mercurial, comes up with crazy schemes, most of which fail, going back to the Dardanelles invasion in the First World War. Financial all over the map, with not only in his own personal business. He was for the gold standard before he was against it. He was against free trade before he was for it, and then he was against it. He was against devaluing the pound. All the modern economists, John Maynard Keynes, and these people he just thought were imbeciles. He was against the coal miners and wanted to use the army against them in the general strike of 1926 until he came to love the coal miners. He had the temerity to campaign for the little guy, the yeoman farmer, he would call them, small workers, mill workers, coal miners, railroad engineers. And this is the guy who wore pink silk underwear, stayed in the best hotels in the world in private suites, was accompanied everywhere by his butler, who never, Winston, lit his own cigars, but the butler would light it with a warmed candle and also warm his brandy snifter with it. He was in the right party for that sort of oligarch, the Conservative Party, but he really did love the little guy, which is why his fellow conservatives hated him. And he did campaign for the workers. And early in the 20th century, he was against Social Security insurance and taking care of unemployed people. And then he was for it. After the war, when Labor took over and ruined everything, he was against it again. He flip-flopped more, Winston Churchill did, on every issue than one of those slinkies I had when I was a kid that would twist and turn and flip and flop down the stairs and then end with a big plub. And yet, he stepped up when it mattered in 1940, when the Blitz began, when the evil incarnate of, it's not moral relativism, it's evil of Nazi Germany threatened existentially Great Britain, and he believed us. And so this 67-year-old, who a lot of people call a mental case, all over the map, literally and figuratively, steps up. Everyone doubts him. The king didn't even want him to be prime minister. And the rest, as you say, is history. So in talking with folks about Donald Trump, what struck me, what really got me going, was a lot of editorials in Northeast newspapers all over the country by usually sane, rational columnists who might be too far to the left for me. I'm kind of a Rockefeller-type Republican. And there's been a spate of them lately, and they run, the theme is, give Trump a chance? Hell no. We have to resist, we have to fight. This is an oligarch. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute. Yeah, we should give him a chance. See, journalists like to flatter themselves with a slogan that journalism is the first draft of history. Ooh. Well, I was thinking about that on the way down. Colonel Robert McCormick, Chicago Tribune, October and November of 1941, his draft of the first draft of history was, those little yellow Japs will never, ever attack us anywhere near our possessions, A, because we're better, and B, because they can't see at night, and C, because how are they going to get from, say, Tokyo to Pearl Harbor? I think he actually published an editorial like that on December 5th or 6th, 1941. So there's, where in the history books is Colonel McCormick's editorial? I mean, history moves on and renders those first drafts, by and large, meaningless, useless. History will be written, and as Larry said, in 2 or 4 or 6 or 24 years, something's going to be written about Donald Trump. But here's a guy who has built his empire and has used the bankruptcy laws like Winston. You can go right down the line. And I know Bill Manchester might be spinning his grave saying, oh my goodness, Paul, you're comparing the two. No, I'm just comparing the realities of this candidate and that old candidate. And at least Donald Trump doesn't, drink a lake full of champagne and wine and scotch every day and smoke 12 cigars. He's a healthy guy. Now, 16 years ago, he was going to run for the Reform Party candidacy. That was the party that Ross Perot in 1980, I think, had secured, 20% of the vote? 19%. Trump was putting out feelers 16 years ago. And I've gone back into the archives, including my paper, and they were saying, what's in it for him? What's he up to? This egotistical, narcissistic, the adjectives were already flowing. What's he up to? My editor asked me if I didn't outrun them, like go to Cuba, they would find something for me to do. And this time it was go over to Mar-a-Lago and profile the guy. Well, I called his secretary, Norma, her name was, in New York City, and I explained, I'm Paul Reid, I love New York, would like to just shadow Mr. Trump for a few nights at Mar-a-Lago. They were not receptive at all, and I understand why, because my paper, among others, excoriated the guy all the time. A few years earlier, when he wanted to open Mar-a-Lago as a club, the city fathers of Palm Beach just gave him a horrible time. And he finally threatened to sue and reveal, which everyone already knew, that certain clubs in Palm Beach excluded Jews and blacks, not in their bylaws. One club had a memo to members to the effect that if you bring a guest to the club, that guest must be of a stature that we would accept that guest as a member, which meant if your guest was Jewish, don't bother. This is disgraceful. And Trump, in his own way, took it all public. It was ugly. And people are thinking, what's he up to? What's he up to? What's in it for him? The guy was trying to change almost a century of abysmal racial, religious prejudice that was de facto in Palm Beach, not de jure. And it would be like saying, Martin Luther King, what is he up to? Has he got a hotel he wants to open or something? No, when you're doing the right thing morally, and Trump was, then all bets are off. Even if he was up to something, doesn't matter. So I couldn't, he didn't accept my overture for an invite, and I understood why. I knew another author named Ronald Kessler, who's written several books, most recently about the Secret Service, in which book the Clintons don't come out too well. And Ron Kessler had written a book that year, The Season, a season of socializing in Palm Beach, the richest town in the planet, etc. It was a good book, and he gave Trump credit for trying to get his club certified so that he could admit blacks and Jews and anyone else he wanted to admit. So Ron Kessler wrote Trump a letter. It's in my bag here, and he said, "Dear Donald, you and Melania look great at the book party. I heard from Paul Reid. He wants to interview you. I believe you can trust him. He's a straight shooter. He won't do a puff piece, but he's not going to stab you in the back." And they relented. So I got dressed up in my best Hawaiian shirt and went over to Mar-a-Lago one night. Paul Anka was the entertainment out on the patio. I mean, I'm not surprised. Paul Anka is going to be at Mar-a-Lago. Mick Jagger, no. And I went into the grand ballroom, living room, parlor, great room. I mean, it must be 70 by 60 feet with a fireplace about as big as the area you're sitting in there that you could walk into. And I was looking around, and there was a coat of arms above the fireplace. I forget the exact Latin expression. It was a lot of me, us, and I was scribbling the letters in my notebook, and Trump walked over, and he saw what I was doing, and he said, "It means, loosely translated, I believe in me." I've looked it up since. Less loosely translated, it means I put my hopes in myself. It had belonged to Marjorie Merriweather Post, the family that owned Mar-a-Lago. And Trump looked up at it again and he said, "I saw no reason to change it." Then he said this every hour on the hour, I'm not exaggerating, for the next 3 nights, something would come up and he'd look at me and say, "You're with the press. I don't much like the press." And I understood that. And he was kind of cool and reticent and not standoffish because he's hosting 100 people in Paul Anka. And the detail, every flower vase, the place settings, the pillows on the couches, the crystal glasses. He's going around his club. This is what the owner of a restaurant or a hotel does. And if they don't, things are going to go downhill. And I realized on the second or third visit, he was putting in, and his people told me, he was putting in 15-hour days at Mar-a-Lago working after 60, 70-hour days in New York, 60, 70-hour weeks in New York working. And this is what he loved. And the detail, I started jotting down in my notebook, his attention to detail. But he was still kind of reticent and standoffish. And it may have been late on the first night or the second night. I said, "Mr. Trump, I came into the newspaper business 5 years ago or so at age 46. And he looked at me like, well, he thought I was an idiot anyway for being in the newspaper business. And I said, "My brother and I co-owned for 25 years a manufacturing company outside of Boston. We had about 100 employees. We'd pay their rent when they were in trouble, would help with tuition. We were non-union. My shop foreman met the AFL-CIO people at the front gate and said, 'Don't even bother. We're non-union, we're going to stay non-union.'" And Trump nodded at that, and he said, what did you make? I said, "Steam traps." And he knew immediately. Most people I've ever met especially in the South where you don't have as many cast iron radiators. Steam traps are those things that go hiss, and they allow the air to escape from the radiator so that the steam can come in and give up its radiant heat and heat your room. They're also on the back of autoclaves in doctors' offices and pressure cookers in commercial cafeterias in the US Army. They're everywhere. They're on submarines. Trump was nodding, and I said, my brother and I, again, proud of it. I had an opportunity to sell my share. I said, I'm pretty sure that of the 300 people in our newsroom, Mr. Trump, I'm the only one who's ever made a payroll. And I said, I think I might be the only one in the newsroom who knows what that means, except for the business writers who I respected. And so at that point, he opened up, and he started asking me, did I have my product in New York City schools, which we did, thousands of steam traps. And in his buildings, he was very familiar with the product. And he started talking about rebar and pouring concrete and the right conditions in which to pour concrete or not. This is in my story, so it's out there as public record. And Chinese steel versus US steel, the proper tensile strength, 404 stainless versus 304 stainless, and bronze castings versus brass, and cast iron, gray iron, and bulldozers. This was his element. And this was no guy born with a silver spoon that he never had to take out of his mouth. He took his father's empire and made it bigger and bigger and bigger and better. And there were bumps, bankruptcies, trouble. Of course, that's what happens in business. I had a brainstorm the other day. I remember, you may not, I think it was 1999 or 2000, the New York Times bought the Boston Globe newspaper, which I used to write a column for $1.1 billion. It's the biggest newspaper deal in history. The Globe was already going downhill. The New York Times business side had no clue about what was coming as far as the internet and content and social media. $1.1 billion. John Henry, who bought the Red Sox, who used to own the Marlins, recently, about 2 years ago, bought the Globe off the New York Times for $70 million. If I were a stockholder in the New York Times, I would be upset. And at one point, I think it was publicly traded. The Globe was. So bad things happen in business. Unexpected obsolescence, product failure, liability. And I watched this campaign month after month after month of all I'm reading about is Donald Trump doesn't pay his bills, and here's a little old lady in Atlantic City who he didn't help out, and there was nothing that you'd expect from like a Forbes or a Wall Street Journal about the complexities of business. We've reduced politics to people like Hillary saying, I have a plan to put 10 million people to work. I never heard the plan. I don't know if you did. Never heard it. And my dad used to say back years ago, we need a businessman at the time in the White House, someone who can do things. Well, the political establishment rigged it against that sort of thing. I mean, you could be a Democrat or a Republican, but you're probably going to be a senator from Missouri or Massachusetts, and Governor Mike Dukakis. I mean, it was all public servants who dedicated their lives, as the Kennedy family says, to public service. There wasn't really room for a maverick. There were political mavericks, John McCain, Bernie Sanders. People were criticizing Trump all summer long. He's so rude and inconsiderate, and if he wants to push for his progressive, wild reforms, he should do so in a genteel manner and be nice and polite and not do these horrible tweets. And I'm thinking, there is a guy pushing his progressive agenda in a nice, polite, funny way, Bernie Sanders. And a lot of good that did him, because the DNC and the superdelegates, it was rigged against Bernie Sanders. And without getting into the politics of it, that's what led me to those thoughts to mention that to Larry. This would be fun. Yes, we have to give the guy a chance. And those on the left, coincidentally, who will not give him a chance, are making a mistake. And and as far as qualifications, I'm doing a research on a book about the presidents before the Civil War. And I had forgotten Abraham Lincoln was a one-term congressman who left Congress 12 years before he ran for president. And in Congress, he didn't do anything. It took him half the year to get there, and the other half to get home back to Illinois. And so Abraham Lincoln, and from Baltimore through the South, I mean, didn't matter whether he was a one-term congressman or not. I mean, he was hated. And I think his vote total was, 38% or something, Bell and Breckinridge and Lincoln, and the parties were split. He had no mandate. And coming through Baltimore, there were plots to kill him on his way to his inauguration. Within days of Trump being elected, I saw liberal blogs by professors, one of whom my son had at Brooklyn College, calling for Trump to be killed. My son reported it to the FBI, who were probably getting flooded with calls. My son's 24. He's a good kid. He had never experienced this, that Trump must die. It's insane. And I'm thinking back to Lincoln on his way through Baltimore. People wanted to kill him, and all in all, he saved the Union. I don't want to get into discussion of the Civil War, but here we are. And so what would they now have to say about Lincoln, those hack writers at the newspapers back then? It's just mind-boggling. And just the other day, in newspapering, we call the first few lines of a story the lead, L-E-D-E. We can't spell. And there was a story in The Guardian, and I look forward to reading it. It was this researcher at the Folger Museum in Washington in the archives has found smoking guns which show that Shakespeare did write what Shakespeare is thought to have written, that not the Duke of Oxford, or the 17th Earl of Oxford, not Queen Elizabeth or Ben Jonson or other people. A remarkable story, but the writer from The Guardian, and I'm closely paraphrasing here, his lead is, and this is what you want to get readers into the story with. Shakespeare, Heather Wolfe is the archivist's name, and she's down in the bowels of the Folger Museum going through these 400-year-old documents. And she's in the basement archives of the Folger Museum, Washington, D.C. She says, quote, "Shakespeare makes an ideal preparation for Trump's America," end quote. I don't know what she meant by that. If I was the reporter, I'd say, what do you mean by that? The reporter then writes, "You can see her point." What point? And then he writes in his own voice, "Shakespeare would revel in the mad excess, the sinister vanities, and the pervasive stench of cronyism and corruption surrounding the president-elect as America makes the painful transition from Barack Obama." This, if it's the first draft of history, I've been a political junkie for 50 years. I've never seen anything like that. This is a story about Shakespeare authenticity writing plays. It sounds like an editorial in any number of newspapers. This guy couldn't resist. His editor said, "Oh, write a story on Shakespeare." And he's thinking, everybody else is getting to trash Donald Trump. And I'm writing about bloody Shakespeare. Who cares? It's mind-boggling. So I wrote my story about Mr. Trump, and I never gave a damn about, I wasn't in newspapering to be proactive. My editor hated that phrase. He wouldn't hire anyone who said they wanted to be a proactive journalist. I went out and I interviewed people. I respected them. I didn't try to ambush them. I wrote for my readers. I wanted them to see what Mar-a-Lago was like when Paul Anka is playing. And I wrote the story, and I was divorced at the time. I had little kids. And what I used to do was, if I got a rare telephone message from Kurt Gowdy or Ted Williams, this case Donald Trump, I would save it on my answering machine. And going through an old box, I'd save it for my kids. Going through an old box about a week ago, I found this.
End of message. Message returned to archive. Next message.
Paul, this is Donald Trump, and I just wanted to thank you for the nice story. It was really beautiful, and I really appreciate it, and I wish I could have given you more time. Boy, can you imagine how nice it would have been if I did? But that story was really nice and very much appreciated, and you can call me anytime you want. I'm at 212-832-2000. You just ask for Norma, and I appreciate it very much. Thanks, Paul. Bye.
End of message.
He didn't have to do that. He's in New York. I'm a small-town reporter in a small town in Florida. He didn't have to do that. And I was telling Larry earlier, certain people, President George H.W. Bush, Al Gore, I mentioned it to you folks, I'd get letters, and the president sent my son Patrick a Christmas card. I told him he lives with his mother, I'm divorced, and Donald Trump leaves this. He didn't have to do that, and there's an element, and I don't believe it can be denied, of class there, period, like the other people who make a gesture. Christmas Eve, a couple of years earlier, I hadn't escaped my editors. I was at the office writing a story about what I don't know, and I thought, I'll call Walter Cronkite. And I called CBS, and they almost laughed at me, and a young woman said, Mr. Cronkite is on his way to the airport to go to Austria for those fancy horses that I can't pronounce, that he used to love those dancing horses in Vienna. And about 10 minutes later, I got a phone call. It's about 9 o'clock at night on Christmas Eve. It might have been Christmas Eve. And I picked up the phone. There's nobody in the office. There's no news happening unless someone shoots Santa. And on the other end, I hear, Mr. Reid, Walter Cronkite, what can I do for you? And I said, my goodness. And he said, you're a reporter. You know, we have to stick together. And I forget what the question was, and that impressed me. And I'm so blessed to have met people like that, and Carl Sagan and Ted Williams. I could go on for another hour about Ted. And so I found Mr. Trump to be amiable, smart as hell when it came to details and business. And I went around, and I'll end on this note, I went around to his employees, and I said, what's the boss like? Oh, he's wonderful. He helps with tuition. He pays the water bill. He helped my mother when she was sick. And I thought, yeah, well, of course you're going to say that, because if you don't, he's going to fire you. And they said, no, wait a minute. Ask us how long we've been with him. I said, oh, that's very good. How long you been with him? 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. The loyalty was magnificent. And I recognized it going back to my days with my crew of 80 to 100 people. And, you know, we would stick together like a Marine company. And Donald Trump's employees would stick with him through thick and thin. And that very week, and this is a public record in the New York Times, that very week, a woman was being thrown out of her Washington Heights apartment in New York with a little boy who was sick and needed a $5,000 medicine machine. And the landlord threw them out. And Trump and the United Way, I think, came up with about $5,000 apiece to put her in a new apartment with a new machine. And the New York Times ran that story. And in all the nights I was with Trump that week and beyond, he never mentioned it, never. And when I learned about it, I asked one of his good friends, why didn't he mention it? He said, because it's private. It's private. The New York Times mentioned it. And not to be too cute, but of course you've heard that story all through the campaign, right? And then he did the same thing for a woman in Georgia who was going to lose the farm after her husband committed suicide and the insurance wouldn't cover it. He came in and helped her save the farm. Wouldn't talk about these things. I can think of no other politician who, even when they kiss a baby, they have to not only talk about it, they have to be on the nightly news about it. And so I would close with saying we are in tough times, and we should give Mr. Trump the chance that the electorate has allotted to him, the opportunity. And if we don't, shame on us. And thank you very much.